Hey guys, you have really been rocking the challenges. You've been posting great pictures and whatnot. So I thought it was high time that I gave you a video that shows you the entire process of how this design was put together. So in the challenge, I give you a bunch of images to play with and basically just let you run with what you already know. And then I thought I would give you a video to explain this process. Now, I've used some very basic concepts of composition in this piece, and it is a very simple piece. There is not a lot involved in this one. We have one focal point, which is this daisy. The bulk of the image is up towards the top. The stem pulls the eye down to the bottom and shows you this image back here, and then the signature over here to the right. So it is designed to pull your eye throughout the whole picture frame, the whole picture plane, pardon me. The background is for simply for the sake of interest. It helps elevate this focal point. It brings the eye to this focal point. So having all of this stuff in the background, although it isn't immediately obvious what it all is, it does give you something more to look at other than just a simple black background. Now, I'm going to break this down for you in its simplest possible. I work from the back forward. So we're going to start with that background. Now I've got, this is just a black base coated artist panel. I traced on some lettering and painted that with warm white. I used a stamp with a little bit of warm white. In this case, I used that vintage note stamp. It's one of my favorites. It's some illegible text, and all it really does is create some horizontal patterning in here. And this one, some vertical patterning, and then it comes back down here. So I've simply arranged things sort of randomly around here so that it fills the space, but it doesn't become really crowded. So you can see there's a lot of negative space in here that I did not fill. So this is our base. Now, if I were to just trace on my daisy right now, it would compete drastically with this. So we're going to put 2 or 3 coats of thin asphaltum over top of all of this white before we move on to the next step. So I just took that asphaltum and I put a wash of that thin asphaltum over everything. Now, all this does is sort of knock that lettering back a little bit. And I'm going to draw it real fast. And then we're going to distress this a little bit, which means I'm going to sand this so that this lettering wears down a little bit. And then we're going to give it another wash of asphaltum to really set that back. I like using this technique to subdue. Instead of starting with a mid value, I like working with the white because I've always got somewhere to go. So if it's still too bright, I can make it darker. Whereas if I start with a mid value, I can get too dark really quick. So this gives you a lot more control. So I'll dry this really fast. I like this type of background. It gives you lots of interest back there without being, too busy. Although it can get busy really quick if you overdo it. But just always think about the less is more. Think more about how it fills the space as opposed to, just slapping it on. So there we go. That's dry. Now I've got a nice little sanding disc, something fairly fine. So I'm using one of these. This is one of those sanding discs. But I don't want to saw this down altogether, but I do want to distress this a little. And I prefer to do it after I antique it, simply because if I get a little too heavy-handed, I can, perhaps fix it beforehand or afterwards. So I don't even take my graphite lines off for this because by the time you're done, they're not going to be seeing them anyhow. So I love this distressed look. Here, get a nice thinned bit here. This also eliminates any little flaws that you may see, so you don't have to worry about getting that lettering absolutely perfect. So now that I've sanded that, I'm going to come back in with another coat of asphaltum. And this changes it yet again. So just to recap what I've got on here first, I have a base coat of lamp black. I did some stamping and lettering using some warm whites. I put a wash of asphaltum over everything. Then I distressed it. And now I'm putting another coat of asphaltum all over it. And I love this asphaltum over top of black. It warms up the black so that it's not this really hard, stark finish. Now our lettering looks a bit more subdued, a little worn and tattered. And it's gotten a little darker. And I think we're just about ready for that next step. So I'm going to dry this again. Now our next step is to create a little more texture and a little more contrast that's going to push all of these elements back a little further yet. So I'm going to do that with a little bit of gold. I like using gold with stamps in particular. It gives it a little bit of flash. And it would help if I had some gold on my painting table. I put the gold away. That for a sharp move. I have a little bit of gold paint. I'm using Decor's Extreme Sheen, that 24 karat gold, because it's really super bright. I love this metallic. So I'm just going to put a little bit on my palette, not a ton. And I'm going to roll that out with a brayer. And I'm going to put a little of that on my vintage note stamp, just using that brayer. Again, I'm not worrying too much about it being perfect. I'm not going to have a ton of this. I just want a little bit. But I'm going to go right over that background. I'm going to let it overlap. And I think that's enough. I don't want to have 10 tons of it on there. That's just going to create a little bit of sparkle and a little bit of contrast between the background, all of this stuff back here, and the foreground. And it's also going to tie in some of these colors. So I'm going to dry that real fast. And then while that's drying, I'll just take some of the tackiness out of it. So while that's drying, we're going to talk about this. Now, I showed you how to do this technique, creating a parchment element for some of your artwork. And it's really super simple. You can do this with stamps. You can do this with printed images, whatever you happen to have on hand. It doesn't have to be anything really elaborate. It could be some text. It could be an image. And as in this case, we've got a cicada. And this is from a Stampers Anonymous stamp set. You can use almost anything, just something of interest. I like tearing it because it makes the paper a bit more interesting. And I'm going to put a wash of asphaltum all over this as well. And that raw edge where you tore the paper gets a little bit darker than the rest of the paper. So I'm going to do this on this side. Notice I'm not being too neat and tidy about it. I'm not really worried about how even it is. That really doesn't matter at this stage. And I'm going to dry it. This paper does some interesting things as it dries too. It gets a little bit lighter, takes on more of a sepia type tone. And then I'm going to flip it over and do the same thing to the other side. And this is going to be part of our design element. This is easy to do. It's fun. You could type out somebody's wedding announcement or something, tear it out, and then apply this, draw it a pirate's map or whatever you want. You can create all sorts of fun things with this. And now that I've got that side done, I'm going to dry it. And this paper, it's just copy paper. I'm not using anything expensive or difficult to find. It's just simple copy paper. You can get it at Staples or Office Depot. And I love the fact that it looks so old. Having the color on both sides does wonderful things for this. And the fact that I laid it right into the previous color leaves some interesting marks and pits on the outside. So it doesn't look new. God forbid it should look new. So there, our paper is dry. Reasonably dry anyway. I'm going to touch up a few places. I just want this to be a little deeper. Really like this aged look. By the time you're done, it makes it look like it's been torn out of an old book. And this is a super easy way to customize things. So imagine doing this with some botanical stamps. Tear them up. It'd be super pretty. Easy peasy. So now that we've got that one done, we're going to use a little bit of matte medium. And I've got a little bit of clean water here. Imagine after all of the effort I put into drying this paper, I'm going to wet it again. So I wanted to use this to ground my image. And so I'm going to choose a location. And I'm thinking right about here. I don't want to put it dead center. This is boring. And I have this thing about taking things off the page. I just think that it makes things more interesting. And you can choose how much off you want to go. And I think that's enough in this particular case. So I'm just going to mark the edge. And I'm going to get that paper wet, which means I'm just going to dip it right into my water dish. And I'm going to take some matte medium. And I'm going to brush a coat of matte medium all over my surface right here. Neatness doesn't count. Perfection is to be avoided at all costs. So we're going to brush that out. You want it even. Don't worry about having it out over everything else. It doesn't matter. So I'm going to get that paper wet. And getting it wet helps stretch the paper so that when it dries, we get a nice, smooth, even application. So we don't get bubbles and ripples and ugly things happening. So I can lay that in. And I'm just pushing some of that excess out. And I'm going to take my brush and I'm going to smooth out that paper with a little bit of matte medium. Now you see this halo out here. Don't worry about that. The matte medium dries completely matte, so it's not going to leave a funky spot anywhere. Now you have a couple of options when it comes to the sides. You can either decoupage this right onto the surface, or you can use a nail file and sand off that edge. Whichever method you choose is absolutely fine. So I'm just going to brush a little matte medium over that. And I'm going to dry this real quick, and then we'll be ready to transfer our line drawing on. I love how this looks. Now, at this point, you could spatter this if you wanted to really create an aged look. We're going to spatter this towards the end anyway, so we don't really have to worry about that yet. But it does give this paper a really nice aged appearance. And it does take on a really nice vintage feel. I love how this looks. Almost there. It's just about dry.
I can also edit it, so speed it up, kind of thing.
So here's my line drawing. Now, this is where part of composition is very important. For the most part, people's instinct is to sort of slam things right into the middle. In this particular case, if I put that flower right in the middle, in order to put it in the middle, I would have to tilt it slightly, which could be interesting too. It would have a nice look. But this is what people would do: is they, most of the time, they would put it right in the middle of the picture plane, which is this surface. It still works, but it isn't all that interesting. So I'm going to push mine up closer to the top so that it brings the focal point to the top, and then the stem is going to draw the eye down the piece. I'm also going to offset it slightly so that I'm a little off center, not dead center. And I'm going to bring it a little closer to that edge, so that this piece here, when I extend it, it's going to curve back this way. So essentially I'll be dividing the surface into two pieces, but I'm going to have sort of this S design running through it. So the line of sight takes you over the entire picture plane. So I've got about a ½ an inch from the top and about a ½ an inch from the edge. That should be plenty. I'm going to grab a little bit of tape, and we'll tape our line drawing in place. And then it is time to trace and transfer. So I have traced and transferred. I used some white graphite to do that and my red gel pen. I love this, that you can see where you've been so that your accuracy improves and you don't miss anything, which is a big thing. So that's my red gel pen. The other thing I love about these Uniballs is that 0.38, that fine line. It's not as thick as it would be with a stylus. So in case you were wondering why I use it, that's why. So I'm going to start by base coating my daisy. And I do that with some warm white. And I keep it fairly loose. Again, I'm not really worried too much. Oh, goodness. I have a stray. I'm not really worried about getting it fully opaque first time out. I'm more worried about getting the direction in. I think that's the best way to describe this. I'm concerned about ensuring that those lines or stria in the flower follow the shape of the petals. And if the petals overlap, I leave a thin line like so. And all this does is just, it helps me position things. It helps me see where things overlap. And I don't have to retrace my line drawings. It's the bane of my existence. I detest retracing things. Especially when it's not necessary. If you take a little bit of time. So I'm just putting that one coat of white in. I'm going to do the same thing to the center. You'll notice I'm following the shape of the petals. So those stria, those lines that you see in the paint, are going to help me in the end. Because every time I base coat a petal or put another coat of paint on, I'm doing it in the same fashion. And so it creates some of those stria for you. It's just accomplishes a little bit of work ahead of time. So I'm just going to finish this out real quick. Neatness doesn't count. Perfection is to be avoided at all costs. I love that expression. I live by it. I don't worry too much about the neat and tidy because it can be neat and tidied later. Right now, we just need to get color in and you get to relax a little bit and just enjoy the process. And that's what this is all about. It's not about creating something perfect the first time out. It's about enjoying the process. So just about there. So this is a pretty simple base coat. I'm going to switch to a smaller brush to do the stems. I've got a number 2 rigger here I'm going to use to do these. Now I like to use white gesso or warm white for this. And I'm not really base coating this. I'm just sort of stroking that stem in like so. Try to keep it the same size all the way down and as fluid as I can. So there's our stem. Now I'm going to use some fluid acrylic to paint mine. Hence the reason I'm putting all of this white in. I'm working over a dark background, so you need to have a little bit of white so that you're not competing with all of that and not having to work against it. So gesso and white paint are your friend. I love putting the white base in because it gives those fluid acrylics a nice bright base, helps maintain all those bright colors. If you put transparent paint over a dark color, you lose something. The intensity and vibrancy of the colors is subdued by that black background. So I'm going to come back in and just quickly fill in some of this white on the petals. Again, I'm not worrying too much about, the whole neatness and tidiness of this. I'm more concerned about the opacity and the direction. You see how those stria, those lines in the petals, I follow that all the way back to the center of the flower. 2 coats should do it for this. I don't really see a need for a third. We don't really need to have it fully opaque, solid white. Seems a lot of painting to cover up a lot of what you've just done, all of this texture and all of this pattern and direction, that line that is hidden in there. So the paint I'm using is thinned out a little bit. I use that Jo Sonja's Fast Dry Glaze. You can use just water, it's fine. But I do like my Jo Sonja. So it won't take me long to finish this out. So we're almost there, and then I'm going to do the center of this flower. Now, we've got a lot going on in between this. You can still see graphite lines. You can still see stop and start marks where the paint has not gone right to the edges. That's all going to get worked into this design in the end anyway. So don't beat yourself up if it looks a little rough at first. And almost there. Okay, so now I'm going to just do the center of this flower. And again, I'm not worrying too much about getting it absolutely perfect or absolutely opaque. I'm just filling in this space. And again, wherever there's a shading line, like in the center of that flower, I'm going to leave a little space or follow it in that pattern so that I can discern where that needs to go. So I'm going to have that little line there so I don't have to trace petals back on. There we go. So that is ready to paint. I'm going to dry this really quick. And then we're going to worry about our shadow. There is a shadow behind this flower that helps elevate this piece. And it also shifts things just slightly to one side, gives there's an appearance of how that image shifts a little bit visually. And it pops this flower forward. Even though it's a simple technique, it has a huge impact on how this piece looks. So that should be just about dry. So I'm going to thin out a little bit of lamp black. And I'm going to use my round brush for this. So I'm going to thin out some lamp black. And I do mean thin it out because I don't want this to be full strength. So even though we are painting black on black. So I'm going to pull a little of that lamp black. It's just a wash. It's not full strength. And I'm going to mimic the shape of that flower. So it's a guesstimate at best. It just roughly mimics the shape of the flower, like so. So we've got a petal. There's this petal. Here's the shadow it casts. And then I'm going to come around here, another shadow. So it's just a loose shadow with that lamp black. And you might have to do it a couple of times to get the shape that we want, but we can get there. And you come right up to the edge of the flower because you want it darkest at the edge of the flower, like so. So you can see that that black is interfering with the background. It is deepening and darkening that background. So now we have a shadow underneath our flowers. And you can adjust it as time goes, as you work. If it doesn't, it's dry and you're not happy with that shadow, you can make it a little bit darker. If we started out with just black paint, you've got no place to go from there. And it looks hard and it looks harsh. So now we have a shadow under and behind our flower. So now I'm going to go back to that rigger. And I'm going to take out a little bit of that lamp black, and I'm going to thin it just a little because I want this fairly opaque at this point, but I don't want it completely black. So you need to thin it. Ink-like, I think, is the best way. And you're going to come about 1/4 of an inch away from the stem. So here's my 1/4 inch, and then you're going to follow the shape of the stem all the way down. I'm going to stop at the leaf, and then I'm going to pick it up again back here. And I'm going to maintain that 1/4 inch all the way down. 1/4 of an inch spacing all the way down. So I'm just replicating the movement of that stem on the background. And then I'm going to do the same thing with that leaf. Now that leaf's going to be a 1/4 of an inch space. And I'm just going to replicate the shape of that leaf. Just rough, doesn't have to be perfect. And now I'm going to dry this. I think I made it a little too dark, but that's okay. I'm going to pull some of that color off. It's one of the wonderful things about matte medium. If you mess it up, you can fix it. I'm going to throw a little asphaltum in there and darken that. There we go. That's better. A little asphaltum in that black. I didn't want it quite so solid. I still wanted to be able to see some of that paper right through it. That's better. So now we have a shadow that our flower is casting. And now we're going to paint our stems. We're going to do that with a little bit of, I'm using the green gold from the fluid acrylics for this. This one's going to be fast and dirty. This is an easy one. Because that green gold is so bright, I love this color. And we have that white base down. We have some fudge factor. So it's going to give us a nice bright green. If you're not happy with the shade of the green, if it's too bright for you, feel free to put another coat on. It'll get a little bit darker. Right now it looks a very yellow-green, which is fine. I'm going to base the leaves with this as well. This is such a great color, this green. And one more leaf over here. Matte medium, awesome, awesome stuff. So I've got my green in. So my shading color for this is sap green. If you don't have sap green, you can use plantation pine. You can use any set of colors that you prefer. If you like to work with the Americanas, prefer to work with them, by all means use those. They will work. Just choose something similar as far as tone. So I'm going to shade this with that plantation pine. I love this green. It's so rich, so dark. And I'm going to put a shadow underneath my leaf right here. And there's a shadow underneath this petal. And there's a shadow on the shadow side. So I'm going to pull that shadow up the, would be the right-hand side of that stem. Again, it's not a perfect float. I'm just getting a little color in there. Just like so. All the way up the back. And then you can take a little bit of that warm white with your green gold, that brighter green. Pick up a little warm white just to make it a touch more opaque and, you know, maybe a value lighter. This is going to be your highlight color on this stem. And it's just going to be a simple little line of that warm white down that opposite side. I'm not using a ton of it, and it's just a little bit. And I'm going to use that color to highlight my leaves. I'm going to come back in and shade these as well. But I wanted to get a little So I wanted to get that heat in there. And I have a little too much on my brush. So pull a little of that orange along there. Now I'm going to deepen that with a little bit of asphaltum. I do like that more earthy tone in there. I just make sure I don't use it full strength. So I'm thinning it out quite a bit. And I'm going to deepen that tone with just a small float of asphaltum and do the same thing in here. And it does change how that orange and yellow combination works. It brings it down just a notch, but it still maintains all that heat. So there is our center. So now we're going to jump over to a nice cool color to bring in that, pop up that white flower. So we need a little bit of cobalt teal hue. And again, you can use Bahama blue for this. Any nice bright transparent blue actually will work very nicely. I just happen to be a big fan of this beautiful blue. And this is my shading color. So I'm going to come down towards the base of these petals with a float of this cobalt teal. I love this blue. And I'm just bringing that into the base of the petals like so. And it's very loose. You notice I'm not working too hard. I'm not making it too meticulous. I'm not talking about these perfect little floats. This is just a little color at the base of these petals. And the same here. This is that base, so I need a little color there. And underneath where the flowers overlap, where these petals are separated, this is where you get that nice shading. So the position of this flower, as I have it in this piece, this portion of the flower is your focal point. The first thing you look at when you see this piece, it comes right to here. And then the stem has this long, elegant curve that pulls your eye through the picture plane, which is the overall surface, down to this piece, which holds your attention, and then off the page. So you have all of this interest in the background, a focal point, the line that pulls you throughout the piece. That is what I talk about when I'm talking about composition. That's what I mean. It's arranging the various elements so that it comfortably lets you look at the entire painting. So you're not looking at just a piece here, a piece here, a piece here, a piece here. All of these things work together to draw the eye throughout your painted piece. Now, every one of us has looked at a piece we've painted and wonder, what's wrong with this? There's something wrong. You don't know what it is. You can't figure it out, but you know that there's something about it that isn't quite right, that is hard to look at, that it's not what you wanted. And we all do it. I still do it. I look at a piece for hours and wonder, okay, what's wrong with this? What did I do wrong here? What did I not put in the right place? How did I organize the subject matter so that it makes for the most appealing or the most visually appealing piece? And this is what it is. It's that composition. It's how the items or the simple elements that you've put into a piece are arranged so that you get a piece that is appealing to the eye. And so it doesn't need to be this really over-the-top elaborate painting. It can be as simple as a daisy, a single daisy on a surface. What makes it more appealing is how I've arranged the other elements within it. In this case, instead of just laying the daisy on top of this, I elevated it. So I put a shadow back here, and it lifts the daisy off of this surface. So when you're looking at the piece, there is depth, there is movement. It's not a straight stem, so there's movement. I've changed the angle of the daisy so that the face is aiming this way. But I've put all that bright color right there, so it pulls the eye right here to the focal point and then lets you go all the way around, or vice versa. This is interesting, but it follows that stem up to the focal point. So it works in both directions. So I'm just going to add a little shadow to my daisy. I'm going to do that with some thinned asphaltum, just to age my flowers, and it tones this blue that we have in the flowers. Warms it up a little bit, keeps it from getting too cold. And I like how it kind of gives it a greenish cast. That appeals to me. So a nice soft float of asphaltum. Easy peasy. Oops. A little too much there. Now, if you want to brighten up these flowers, if you're finding that they need a little oomph, just go and get a little bit of titanium white, and you can pop a little highlight out towards the ends of the petals. It will do a couple of things. It's going to give you a little more opacity up towards the tips of the flowers, to the petals. It's also going to make things nice and bright, and it's going to increase the contrast out here. So at the edges of these petals, if I put that punch of white, you see how that petal suddenly takes on a little more sharpness and a little more contrast, because that brighter white, that snow white, jumps off of that. So there is our little highlight on the tips of our petals, just to keep things looking nice and bright. Just like that. So all this really does is just crisp up a few things. Remember I said about you don't really have to worry about the neat and tidy just yet. And this is where that little float does wonders for you. This is what cleans up those ragged looking edges, is that just that little float of titanium white, keeping that bright white to the outside edge. So I'm going to dry that. We're going to finish off the center of this flower, and then we have one more little technique to do, well, two, and our daisy will be done. So dry that really quick. Now I'm using a zero rigger for this, but you can use whatever you have on hand. If you like using a stylus, by all means go ahead and use it, but I prefer to use a brush. I don't like the dots in the center of this to be too consistent. So I'm just using a little bit of asphaltum to put some random little dip dots in various sizes along the edges of my daisy in the center here. And I let those dots come out onto the petals. This just sort of gives it a softer, more delicate look towards the center. And then I'm going to switch to a little bit of white, same brush, and I'm going to repeat this on the other side, again taking some of those dots out onto the petals. This just helps keep this centerpiece looking soft, kind of fluffy, which appeals. You don't have to be they don't have to be perfect. In fact, it's better if they're not. They're more interesting if they're not. And again, I like to keep them out onto the petals. This just keeps everything looking soft. And I'll throw a couple more dots in the center here in this shaded area. There we go. Now, everybody sees me using these pens all the time. I really like these for a variety of reasons, but I love them for this. I can add little fine stria and detail. I like the sketchy little lines on the outside edges of the petals like so. I just like how this gives it a very soft look. I mean, you can skip this if you don't like it. I mean, that's entirely up to you. This is just my method. I love how this looks. I don't worry too much about whether or not they're on, directly on the white or off the white. If it goes onto the background, that's okay too. So it's just a loose, sketchy line all the way around. I do this on all the petals. I do it on the leaves. If you prefer to do it with a brush, you could do it with a brush, but I like how fine this pen does this. So, easy peasy. We will have a pattern for this available on the website this week. But quite honestly, if you're part of this membership group, then you already have everything you need. It's in your challenge. So all of these elements are in there, so you can play to your heart's content. So I think I'm just about there. I think I've got my daisy where I want it to be. And I got to show you a really fun technique. Now, I'm going to pop a little stenciling in here just because I can and I like it. One of my favorites, of course, is this postage stamp. So I'm going to do that with a little bit of gold. I'm not going to do a ton of it. I'm just going to have a little bit here and there. Just so it matches up with that stamp that we put in there with the lettering. So I'm going to use a little bit of gold. Oops, I picked up some white somewhere along the line. There we go. So I'm going to use a little bit of gold. I'm not going to worry about it being absolutely perfect. Just sketch that in. And I'm going to bring this one down here because I love when they overlap other elements. This is my postage stencil. I love this one. It's just one of my favorites. I have a thing about cancellation stamps. It's just one of my faves. So we've got a little bit of stenciling in. This gives you another layer and another little bit of interest. And then I'm going to sign this in a rather unique way, which I thought was a fun way to do this. So I have these. These are old-fashioned wax seals. I have one with my monogram on it, and I have one with a bumblebee. And this is sealing wax. And you can get sealing wax in a variety of different colors. And it comes in a variety of different styles, too. In this case, it comes what looks like a candle, but this is more traditional sealing wax. I'm using bright gold for this. You can also get this in pellets. But this one I like it because I can control it, and it kind of works like a candle. So I'm going to light that. And this is how I'm going to seal it. I'm going to let this wax melt. And it will drip onto my surface. Should probably have grabbed one that's not quite so short. But it does melt very quickly. I love that it gets a little smoky. And so you've got, it doesn't just come out as pure gold wax. You've got little bits of soot and whatnot. And it just makes things more interesting. And you just sort of let that puddle, we want to get, maybe a nickel size puddle on here. Maybe a little more. It takes a little bit to get it to melt. That's okay. It should be roughly the size of your, here we go. Should be roughly the size of the stamp by the time you drop the stamp into it, so that it goes around. Okay, I think we're good. So I'll let that drip. This is just a fun and interesting way to sign something. So I'm using my monogram, and I just drop it into the wax, like so, and I let that wax ooze out. And then just leave the seal in it until the wax cools. And it doesn't take all that long. And this is just a neat way to sign your artwork. This one is my signature in TM. So they're not all that expensive. You can find them fairly easily online. I ordered this one through Amazon, believe it or not, and got my own um, monogram on it, which I thought was fun. And there. So there is my gold seal for my finish. Now the last thing that I would do is just simply spatter this with a little bit of either thin white or some thin asphaltum or both. That's entirely up to you. So you can take out your favorite fugly brush and a little bit of thin asphaltum, and I'm going to spatter. I'm putting a fair amount on this piece of parchment down here, and a little less everywhere else, and a little bit of thinned warm white for the rest of it. Just a little, I don't want a ton of it on there. There we go. And your piece is finished. A couple of coats of matte spray and it will be ready to hang. And that is our challenge piece in composition.